So thank you very much. I'm very glad to be here, you know, sometimes things look a little bit rosier from far, but so I'm going to give you my perspective from all the way from California, but having observed things in Ukraine from the beginning. So. Let me start by just going back to the beginning, you know, when it all started. So, compared to many other big events, you know, the Euromaidan revolution is really one of the major events in the early 21st century. You know, 10 years after the Orange Revolution, you know, 10 years after people went to the streets in the middle of the winter to protest the Yanukovych regime, to protest the corruption. They defied the cold winters. They defied the snipers. They rejected the compromises that were being offered by, you know, international negotiators, and won. Yanukovych left. So you know, there are not many revolutions in general. There are not many revolutions that succeed. So you know, that's a very important starting point. And one reason the Euromaidan was very important is that from day one, Vladimir Putin, saw how important it was. He saw that this could be a threat for him. He saw that with what was happening in Ukraine, there could be one day a Russian Maidan, and you know, we may think you know, that's kind of dreaming, but he saw this as a big danger, and this is why. This is the main reason he has been trying to destabilize Ukraine, to try to destroy its democracy and bring back a Yanukovych type regime. That's what he wants. That's what he's trying to do. He hopes he can make it happen. And despite the destabilization campaign, the invasion of Crimea against all international law, the Eastern Ukraine war, the terrorist attacks, the massive spreading of lies in the media, you know, here in Russia, in the rest of the world, so far, I have to say, so far, Ukraine's democracy has been holding well. There have been presidential elections. Putin hoped they would not take place. Presidential elections took place. There have been parliamentary elections. The parliamentary elections took place. And there will be local elections in October. And you have to realize that each election that takes place is already a victory for democracy and a defeat for Putin. So this is where we stand. This is how we have to do this. And personally, I have to say that despite what's going on in Eastern Ukraine, despite the destabilization, despite the very catastrophic economic situation that is facing Ukraine, and it is a catastrophic economic situation, so people are suffering, it's bad, I think, and I really think, I'm optimistic that the strength, the hopes that have been unleashed by the Maidan can really succeed in establishing a strong democracy, in rooting out corruption, and eventually build a prosperous economy that is going to be part of Europe. I am also hopeful that Ukraine can provide an inspiration for democracy in Russia, but that is not for tomorrow. That is certainly for the future. But having said that, the key for democracy to be successful, and the jury is still out, we're only in the beginning. For Ukraine to be successful, it has to consolidate its democracy. And it's only at the beginning. It has to thoroughly reform its institutions. One election, 2 elections are not going to create democracy, are not going to consolidate democracy. votes of reforms in the parliament are not going to be enough to consolidate democracy. Support from the West is not going to be enough to consolidate democracy. The key, and this is where I'm speaking to you, and I think this is really very important, the key for democracy to succeed in Ukraine is to have an active and thriving civil society. The key is that the forces that were unleashed by the Euromaidan movement lead to pressure from below, to constant pressure from below, to reform politics, to reform government administration, to introduce transparency in government, to introduce accountability. The mobilization that existed, and that was so strong, so successful in defeating Yanukovych, this mobilization has to be transformed into organization, into thorough reform of institutions. And so here I have to put things into perspective to understand why things are so difficult these days. We have to understand the past. The past is always the key to the future. And we have to understand the Soviet legacy. So in the Soviet system, in the communist system, and you're too young to have really known how it was, in the communist system, the government apparatus was there to monitor, to control, to repress citizens. It was really a powerful force trying to control the citizens. And so bureaucrats, anybody having some power in the government apparatus, they had power over the citizens. They could use their power, and they were not accountable to people. They were only accountable to the people above them, to the party leaders, to the government leaders, etc. Now you say, well, that's the past. That's a long time ago. The problem is that after the collapse of communism, in many countries, those who had a government position, low-level, middle-level, higher-level bureaucrats, have used their power to enrich themselves. So all of a sudden they said, okay, communism is finished. What do we do? So we have some power. We can extract bribes from people. We can steal resources. We can grab ownership. We can get things privatized to ourselves. And so this collapse and this abuse of power by people led to generalized corruption and quasi-collapse of the state functions. Like, the health system started not to functioning well, the education system, the security, everything completely riddled with corruption. And once corruption installs itself, it's really a bit like a cancer. It's a bit like a cancer, and it's very difficult because you have corruption chains. So what do I mean by corruption chains? That is, everybody or most people have done something wrong, and then they think, if I don't denounce the other guy who did something really wrong, they're not going to go after me. So everybody stays silent, doesn't do anything about the others, and then just continues operating. And of course, these corruption chains just create silence. They create continuation of corruption. They create cynicism, and this is certainly what the protest movement was about. Now, to have a well-functioning democracy, democracy is not just about elections. Even free elections is not enough to have a well-functioning democracy. In a well-functioning democracy, you need to have a well-designed institutions of government. That is, you need to have separation of powers between the executive branch of government, the president, the government, the legislative branch, the parliament, the Senate, when you have a Senate, and the judiciary branch of government. This is a universal truth in all democracies that separation of powers between the executive branch of government, the legislative branch of government, and the judiciary are absolutely necessary. And this is, over 100 years of experience with democracy in the world. The separation of powers is as important as elections. You don't want the executive to concentrate the powers. You don't want the executive to control the judiciary. You don't want the executive to have control over the legislature. And so this is really fundamental if you want the government or the democracy to protect human rights. Because after all, government is about its citizens. It's about securing freedom for its citizens, protecting human rights, assure the rule of law, making sure that people are equal before the law, that if they have some conflict with somebody, that they can be treated equally compared to other citizens, so that it should not be the case that people in power should have better treatment before the law. And so a well-functioning democracy minimizes abuse of power, including corruption. Democracy never completely eliminates corruption because human nature is what it is. I think when we think about institutions, we should not be naive. We should not think that people are going to be nice and behave nicely. On the contrary, we have to assume that people will be greedy, people will be tempted to abuse powers, and so you have to devise rules to prevent them from doing that or prevent them from getting away with it. So well-functioning democracy can minimize abuse of power, make politicians accountable to citizens, and what's really important there is that democracy empowers the citizens, that citizens think they have a little bit of power, not just through their vote, but also through their actions, through demonstrations, through their expression on social media, through being part of organizations, through being part of associations that can help bring change at the local and at the national level. Now, I want to go further and say that democracy is not only important to protect human rights and to make sure that citizens are equal before the law, but I think, and this is based a bit on the experience of probably the last 150 to 200 years, democracy is necessary to protect property rights, is necessary as a precondition to have successful investment and prosperity. And so now you might think there are some countries that can have some decades of growth, like China, etc. But many foreign investors went to China, and they were very enthusiastic. And in the last few years, many of them are being expropriated. They feel that the Chinese government is taking away their property. And so there is an important problem in economics that is called the capital levy problem. And this is the following. This is, in general, take any government, could be an autocratic government, they would like to have a low taxation on investment. They would like to tell investors, come invest in my country, or come invest, and we will give you low tax rates because we want you to invest. And that's probably what they want. So in technical terms, we say there's a high tax elasticity of capital, because if you have high tax rates, people go invest elsewhere. But once the investment has been made, once people have invested in a factory, have set up the whole business, etc., it's much more difficult to leave. So once they have been there, there is the temptation of government to expropriate capital. And this is a very general phenomenon. It's a very general phenomenon that before people invest, you want to be nice to them, but once they have invested, then governments have an incentive to expropriate capital. And so autocratic governments cannot solve this problem easily. They cannot solve this problem easily because they're not accountable. They're not accountable. And democracy is very important here, because in an industrial world where capital plays a very important role, democracy can provide institutions that create this commitment so that there should not be a too high capital taxation, that capital taxation is going to be relatively stable, and this is because democracy can guarantee the rule of law. So democracy is fundamental not just for human rights, it's also fundamental, I think we understand this more and more, to have a prosperous economy. Now, this is the most important part now. You can have a very good democratic constitutions, you can have very good rules on paper, but this does not guarantee good governance. This does not guarantee that your democracy is going to function well. The key thing is to have a very active participation of civil society. By civil society, I mean the millions of people who are organized in myriads of associations, groups, unions, associations, political parties, non-governmental organizations, who are fighting collectively for particular causes, be it for the environment, be it against corruption, be it for equality of men and women. These associations that serve as watchdogs for government to prevent or to denounce government abuse, and that are able to mobilize on that basis. So civil society is really a key here. And so let me give you an example, because this is not just me talking. This is about what we know from social sciences. There's a very famous book here that you see by Robert Putnam that's called Making Democracy Work, and it's about Italy. It's about civic traditions in modern Italy. And the interesting about that book, which is a very famous book, is that Italy, as it exists since after World War II, is a unified country. The North and the South have exactly the same political institutions, the same laws, so it's a unified country, everything is the same. But there are very different civic traditions in the North. So the North has always been very active, lots of associations, people have been very active politically, not so in the South. So south of Italy, Sicily, or Campania, Basilicata, etc., because of their history, it was much more feudal. They were oppressed for a very long time, and so there are very few traditions of civil society. Well, what Putnam showed is that regions in the South, despite having the same formal institutions in the whole country, there were big differences in the actual governance, and there still are today differences in the actual governance. So he showed that regions in the South had much higher instability, that is, higher turnover of government, more delay in budget approval, worse statistical apparatus, less transparency, lower quality of legislation, and lower provision of public goods. So just to give you an example, there was a national funding of daycare programs. So the national government gave to every province in Italy on a per capita basis budgets to the local governments for daycare, okay? And so everybody should have the same result, normally, given that everybody got the same budget. Well, Emilia-Romagna, that's the place where Bologna is, spaghetti bolognese, that's Emilia-Romagna. They had set up a daycare center for every 400 children after 2-3 years. In the South, only one center for every 12,560 children. Okay, you see the same budget, same money, much better results in the North than in the South. In the South, some of this money diverted by corruption or inefficiency, incompetence, etc. And there are many more examples. So this just shows how important civil society is. And I have done some research myself comparing civil society in different countries that were under the Soviet influence, and with some co-authors. And we found that in countries where you had a stronger civil society under communism, so let me give you an example. You know, in Poland, you had the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church was a counterpower to the communist system. There was the Solidarność, the Solidarity trade union. In Czechoslovakia, you had the Chart 77 that was headed by Václav Havel, very mature and active dissident movement. You know, these are just a few examples. Well, we found that the countries where you had a much more active dissident movement, you know, protest movement, even already under communism, those countries did much better directly after the transition. That is, that democracy took hold in a much more stable way in those countries compared to the former Soviet Union. And in the former Soviet Union, the collapse of communism was an accident, was really an accident. The government had a meeting one Sunday evening at the house of the then Prime Minister, I think Popov was his name, I don't remember exactly. They got drunk and they said, let's get rid of Gorbachev, let's do a coup against Gorbachev. So they arrested Gorbachev, they did this coup, but it was so incompetently organized that they failed. And so that's how communism collapsed in the Soviet Union. It was this failed coup. And then I went there just 1 week afterwards, and people were in the street and say, well, I can't believe, you know, communism, the Communist Party is being outlawed. So all of a sudden, people didn't realize what was happening. It was a bit like an accident, you know. And so what happened is that because the fall of communism there was a little bit like an accident, and because it was not so much the result of democratic mobilization, people within the elite in the Soviet Union, people who had some positions, you know, in government or, you know, in the Communist Party or whatever, took advantage of this and became the oligarchs that you've seen, you know, in Russia and Ukraine and other countries. And they took advantage of this vacuum that existed. And so that's what happened in Russia, that's what happened in Ukraine. However, in Ukraine, even though civil society was initially quite weak, I have to say that, you know, with the Orange Revolution, with the Euromaidan, and again today I've been talking to many people who are active as watchdogs of corruption or things like that, it seems to me that now the civil society is much more active, and as I said, this is going to be a key for the success of a democracy. So, if we look at what's been happening, I actually gave a talk in Boston on what was happening in Ukraine 3 months ago, when so, you know, there are lots of bad things, but just looking at the last 3 months, there are quite a number of things that have been happening. And you know them better than me, so I'm not going to dwell on them. But there's this National Anti-Corruption Bureau that has been set up that seems to go in the right direction. The judicial reform has started. There's a strengthened role of the Supreme Court. There's going to be new rules for exams and qualification of judges, so all these things go in the right direction. There's deregulation, reduction of licenses and registration requirements, abolition of various agencies and police departments, reduction in civil servants, reforms in public procurement, sort of making it electronic, digitalizing of services. So there are many things that have been happening. So changes in joint stock company law to improve corporate governance, the energy reform, not just the changes in tariffs, but also the opening to competition and investment, the plans to break up Naftogaz, changes in monetary policy, fiscal policy, pension reform, beginning of banking reform, increases of social assistance. Now, for all of you who live in this country, you're probably very impatient. You're saying, well, you know, that's just the beginning. You know, nothing is being implemented so far. There are a lot of problems. But I think these things go in the right direction. And so This is actually a result of the previous parliamentary election, so we're having some progress here. If the push from below continues, I think this is not bad. Now, one thing I think that is very important to mention in this context is if we're serious about democracy, if we're serious about rule of law, if we're serious about transparency and good governance, then actually the rule of law needs to be implemented from the start, not after institutions are reformed. And that should be a consensus, I think, in the society, that you want the rule of law, but the rule of law should be started to be implemented fully today, not tomorrow, not after tomorrow. And there is a danger of what I call reform Bolshevism. What do I mean by reform Bolshevism? Well, this is something that we saw in Russia. So people thought, okay, the communists have left, now we are Democrats, we're in power, we're going to do the good things. So we don't need to use, all these procedures, etc., because we're the good guys. We just give orders and everything will be fine. Well, look at where Russia is today. So they got Putin eventually, and it's hard to say that Russia is still a democracy today. And in a way, even Georgia that made spectacular reforms against corruption. I think many of the reforms in Georgia should be an inspiration, and are already to a certain extent an inspiration for Ukraine. But it was also partly a problem in the sense that to go fast, to try to be efficient, to try to be decisive, the executive in Georgia sometimes bypassed the law, and that's a problem. That's a problem. Now, the issue is, and sort of what I want to make fundamental, is that sure there have been some very encouraging reforms these last few months, but the best government cannot succeed in the long run if there is not some deep institutional reform. And so here, as much as I'm optimistic, what I want to say is that if there is no deep institutional reform in this country, democracy is not going to work. So it's not something you can bypass. It's something that's really very important. And so again, I'm not a citizen of this country. You probably know much better, so I'm not going to say do A, B, and C. I'm just going to give you some very important, I think important ideas from other countries that should be inspiration for reform strategy. So some key principles. So resources are rare. I'm an economist, so that's something important. There are very few people who are willing to work for genuine reforms. There are a lot of people who don't care at all about reforms. There are even fewer people who are honest and competent, because to be efficient you need to be honest and competent. And so this means that even when there are so many things to be done, it's very important for whoever is in power to throw resources into making reforms that work. Not just vote laws and then not following it through. It's very important to concentrate on battles one cannot afford to lose. One has to show success. So attacking too many people at the same time, too many enemies, it can be courageous, but not necessarily a recipe for success. And so the very important thing is to concentrate on breaking monopolies of power. Wherever there's a source of monopoly of power somewhere, we have to find ways of breaking it. And I'm going to give you some examples later on. And because that's a key to destroy resistance to reform and creating competition. And again, I'll give some examples later on. One has to create competition at different levels of society, because monopolies, which is the opposite of competition, monopolies is what allows abuse of power, and one has to break this. So Demonstrating success is also very important to build momentum for further reform. If nothing happens, if you just see people talking, and there's no single success of the reforms, people can be discouraged. So that's very important to demonstrate success. Communication is also key to support. If there are a lot of laws that are voted or measures that are taken, and the government doesn't give explanations, the government is not able to convince people that it's doing the right thing, then it's as if these things were not being done. So communication is absolutely critical to build trust and to keep trust at every stage of the reform process. And then, you know, you cannot do reforms only from above. You have to rely on the forces of civil society. So politicians who think that they can, just with some experts, solve the problem for you, that's just not how it's going to work. It's only if the forces below of civil society are mobilized, are kept included in the reform process, that things are going to work. So let me now talk a little bit more specifically about different reform areas. So first I'll talk about reform of political institutions. So the main goal, and you know, again, when you think of this, you have to see what is the goal. You know, the goal is you know, what is the most important to keep in sight. So the main goal should be to reform Ukrainian state apparatus to empower people more, so that you know, that the power is shared among the population. To introduce the rule of law, transparency, and fight new forms and occurrences of corruption. And so to do that, a critical thing, and at this stage I would probably say this is the most important. If you want to sort of keep in mind, one of the things I say this evening is a constitutional change is badly needed in this country. And so a constitutional change can only happen if there is a broad societal process. The countries that have successfully introduced a constitution, like the United States or France and Germany would be others, are cases where the constitutional process has involved not just politicians, but has involved not just experts, but has involved also activists, people from civil society, people who are active, you know, who have stakes in different things. And this is even more important, I think, in Ukraine today. We need a constitutional change, and constitutional change has to be done by a very broad group of people, that there should be, you know, couple hundreds, I don't know, 200, 300 groups of people with some politicians, some local mayors, or activists, experts that think about how to change the rules of society. And of course, a key issue here is decentralization. Now, decentralization, I know, in this country is kind of, a difficult topic because of Putin talking about federalism, etc. That's not at all what I have in mind. What I have in mind is that it's very important at the local level, in cities, in communities, that the elected local leaders have some power, have some budgets, have some taxes that they can decide over, so that the new generation of politicians, your generation, who's going to be involved in politics, can actually make the government closer to people at the local level. That's actually very, I think is very, very important. So, yeah, I mentioned already, this idea of the constitutional convention. I just want to add here, there is not one set of good institutions. You can have a presidential democracy, you can have a parliamentary democracy, you can have electoral system with a majoritarian system, like in the United Kingdom, two-round elections like in France. You can have proportional elections like in Germany or Holland, etc. What really matters here is that people discuss the pros and cons of different rules of government, and that there should be a societal consensus on what is going to be chosen. And once you have that consensus, then there is going to be legitimacy. Legitimacy is very important. People have to feel that the constitution is their constitutions, of the people of the country, so that the rules of that constitution are going to be followed. In many countries, when the constitution is not legitimate, people don't necessarily follow the rules. They try to bypass the rules because they're cynical. They just don't believe in the rule. So that's for political institutions. Now, let me say a little bit about reform of government administration. That is something, very, very important. And as I mentioned, earlier on, the government administration inherited from communism is one where abuses of powers lead to corruption, stealing, etc. And just some ideas here. Of course, many of the reforms that are needed are also in line with the economic reforms that are needed, to keep the budget deficit under control, etc. Elimination of wasteful agencies, reduction of bureaucracy, very strong deregulation, public procurement reform. So these are things that improve government but also reduce the cost of running government. Active and publicized audits of the state sector is very important to establish credibility. Tax audits for oligarchs and rich Ukrainians, so that people understand that taxation is serious. Some ideas that are being talked about but that have been used in Georgia, for example, is allowing choice of foreign licensing. You could choose that some licensing rules would be imported from Germany. Why not? You could outsource even organization of public procurement to big accounting firms that have a reputation. And so the general idea is that there should be competition in public services, that people should be able to choose to have a choice in how they get their public service. And so if you can choose, actually many big businesses do that. Many big businesses choose which country's law that they want to use in arbitration with others. So I think citizens should be able, if you want to set up a small business, can you use the regulation from this country, or ask to have rules from other countries. And so Georgia here certainly did some of those. So you can say this is not realistic, but a lot of the things I listed have been done in Georgia. And so in Georgia, where corruption was probably even worse than here. Georgia was probably one of the worst countries in the world with corruption. So they were very active in trying to find how to minimize face-to-face interactions between bureaucrats and the public. Actually, in many public offices in Georgia now, you have cameras that record the conversation between officials and the public, but you also digitalize as much as possible many public services, including taxation, forms that need to be filled in, so that these are ways of reducing corruption. Mandatory electronic cash registers for small business, so these are important. And so Georgia even used foreign certification systems, as I said, and also subcontracted temporarily some public services abroad. So now, reform of judicial institutions. This is actually one of the most difficult topics in Ukraine, because on one hand it's very urgent. You cannot have a good rule of law, whatever laws you vote, if the judicial system is not working properly, if the judicial system is ripe with corruption. But it's complicated because, you know, judges are professionals, so they are people, you know, with a law degree. They are, you know, not everybody can be improvised as a judge overnight. So if most of the judges are corrupt, how do you do? It's not an easy situation, and you can't replace, you know, 80% of the judges or 70% of the judges overnight. That's very difficult. So how do you do? Well, here I think you have to use one of the principles I was talking about. If you have limited resources, try to concentrate them on a few things. So for example, it's probably impossible for the existing judicial system to start anti-corruption cases against everybody who has been corrupt at one point. That's just not going to work. But you can, for example, say we will insist on any new case of corruption. Any new case of corruption that is brought to court, that's much smaller subsample, we will show zero tolerance. We will show zero tolerance. So the priority should be on new cases of corruption, and this is something that can be done, and you need a smaller number of judges, and if you do it well, people will understand that there is zero tolerance. An idea that goes in the spirit of using competition in the public service is one should, at least in a temporary way, allow citizens to use the court jurisdiction of their choice. So if people are living in some district where it's well known that all the judges are completely corrupt, give the right to people to say, I want for my business conflict to use the court in another district. Okay, because that's, you know, that gives people choice of the court they want to use. Well, you will say, well, that's going to disorganize things, and yes, it will disorganize things, but by giving people the choice, you also see people vote with their feet. You see where they go. So you see which judicial districts should get more resources, and you see, you know, where people do not go. So those are places where you need urgently to replace bad judges with good judges. So finally, and I've spoken long enough already, democratic culture. So you can have good political institutions, you can have good judicial institutions, but you really need to have a democratic culture. And this is why, you know, usually democracy cannot be imposed from above, it has to come from below. Now, what do I mean by a democratic culture? Several very simple ideas, but really important ideas. First of all, tolerance and respect for other viewpoints. Having civilized debates between people who agree to disagree is a first step. It's not the case that somebody you disagree with is a traitor to the country and is a foreign agent and is a spy, etc. You know, just accusing other people of having bad intentions is not a good way to have a democratic debate. We can make mistakes. We can be wrong. Sometimes we can honestly think that we have one solution, but we're wrong. People make mistakes. Civility and rationality in debates is very important. Debates are won by arguments, not by violence. So sometimes our pride may be hurt, as the other person has the right argument. We have to accept that, you know, sometimes we are won over by arguments. That's the logic of debate. If nobody changes their mind in a debate, the debate is not very useful. So we have to be ready to change our minds as a result of deliberations. Now, as much as tolerance and respect are very, very important, I think it's very, very important to be quite forceful in fighting lies and dishonest propaganda. I must say that you know, since I've been watching things in Ukraine, I was so surprised by the strength and the aggressivity of the pro-Russian propaganda, not just in Russia, Ukraine, but in the rest of the world, that you have these factories of trolls, people who go on the internet and just repeat lies. And as Hitler already knew, if you, Goebbels, you know, said, if you repeat lies long enough, then everybody will start believe them. And that's why it's really fundamental to fight lies and dishonest propaganda. When people propagate lies, This is not just ethically wrong. This is something where one has the duty not just to reject them, but one has the duty to actually show that there are lies and uncover them. Finally, I think it's very important to ban censorship and assure freedom of expression. That's also part of democracy from day one. Forbidding opinions with which one doesn't agree is not a good way of doing things. Good communication and information, that's very, very important. But also one has to encourage citizens to be informed. Citizens should be informed about the content of laws, about what is at stake. And the media play a role here. I think the media play a role. Information should not just be about juicy scandals, but also to inform people of what is going to happen. And encourage citizen initiative, because citizen initiative is the basis of civil society, and that is what makes democracy survive. So, finally, I've talked long enough. Institutional reform is a very complex process, but it's absolutely necessary if one wants to minimize bad policies, if one wants to reduce abuse of power and corruption. Expertise is very important in these things, so when thinking about institutional reform, it's very important also to learn from foreign experience, one should not copy blindly foreign experience, but learning and debating foreign experience is very important. One should be inclusive, transparent, have broad deliberations within civil society. The mobilization of people was the key to the success of the Euromaidan, and the energies that were unleashed by the Euromaidan must also be used to push for decisive institutional reform, and the key, as I said there, is to have a deep constitutional change in the country. That being said, if that happens, and I'm quite confident that things can go in that direction, then despite the war, despite the economic situation, Ukraine will be very successful, and we will look at this period in the early 21st century as a time of historical change for this country. Thank you very much.